doesn't love a good superhero story? We all, or at least most of us, love the idea of being a vigilante and taking the law into our own hands to do what we know is right. It sounds good in our heads, looks good in movies, doesn't always turn out well in real life. Here are a few stories of times Americans took the law into their own hands. In the mid-1800s in San Francisco, the Sydney Ducks, a gang from Australia, was causing chaos. Sydney, obviously because they're from Australia, Ducks, I don't know. Known for committing crime and arson, and they were blamed for the San Francisco Fire of 1849. Come 1851, the people had had enough, so they formed the Committee of Vigilants. The group had about 700 members and claimed to operate in parallel, but in defiance of the city government. Rather than due process of the law, they took things into their own hands. The committee was responsible for 4 executions by hanging, one of those men for burglary, one for murder, and 2 for what they called, quote, vicious, heinous crimes. 14 men got deported back to Australia, 14 ordered to leave California, and 15 handed over to the regular authorities. This was all in the span of 4 months. They were dissolved in the September elections of the same year, but leadership kept meeting. Come 1856, the committee was reformed. This time, not just concerned with civil crimes, but political corruption. The committee resurrected in the aftermath of a murder believed to be disguised as a political duel. James King, the victim, was a newspaper editor who believed his killer, James B. Casey, won the appointment to the City Board of Supervisors in a rigged election. I mentioned that the earlier committee had about 700 members, the new one had about 6,000, and its president, William T. Coleman, was good friends with then Governor J. Neely Johnson. The committee was hugely successful. They formed a new political party which took political power in the city until being absorbed into the Republican Party in 1867. In the Civil War, Missouri was a border state. They didn't secede, but they didn't fight either. But within the state, there were strong opinions on both sides, like any political issue. Unionists and secessionists in the state had been battling each other since the mid-1850s, and continued for a bit after the war ended. The Confederate supporters resorted to guerrilla tactics during the war, which after the war during Reconstruction evolved into outlaws and gangs. A key figure amongst them in Missouri was Jesse James, who you probably heard of. Between 1865 and 1885, 40 murders occurred in the Ozark region, and not a single suspect had been convicted. This can only go on for so long before the people have had enough and take matters into their own hands. So in 1883, 13 men of Taney County, led by Nat N. Kinney, formed a group that called themselves the Citizen Committee or the Law and Order League. But the public ended up calling them the Bald Knobbers. Yeah, the past was weird. Bald referred to the mountain where they met. Knobbers, sure, why not? Their numbers quickly grew into the hundreds. Initially, they were very successful. However, an opposing gang rised up, calling themselves the Anti-Bald Knobbers. Yeah, not very creative. The leader of the Anti-Knobbers was 19-year-old Andy Cogburn, who was ultimately killed by Kinney, who claimed it was self-defense. Governor Marmaduke, with what a name and choice of hairstyling, sent someone to investigate what was really going on. And upon the representative's arrival, he believed the town had been an atmosphere of order and was happy with what he saw. He did recommend that Kinney dissolve the Bald Knobbers, which they did the following day. However, other groups started popping up. The town of Chadwick in Christian County was a booming town at the time due to the proximity of the railroad. And with the railroad came saloons, brothels, and gambling. Dave Walker and his son Billy formed the new group of the Bald Knobbers, not long after Kinney had disbanded the original. And yep, this was their outfit. Again, the past is weird. But they got to work right away, burning down saloons. Flash forward, David Walker was working on disbanding the group, however his son Billy had other plans. See, there had been a man named William Edens who was publicly speaking out against the group. Billy and several new members wanted to do something about this, despite David's pleas not to. So Billy led several members to Eden's house. When they found he wasn't home, they went down the street to his parents' house, where they found him, his wife, his sister, and brother-in-law, and their children. The Bald Knobbers burst in firing off shotguns. William Edens and his brother-in-law were both killed. 80 men were indicted, most got off with fines for unlawful assembly. Although David Walker had tried to stop this, he, his son Billy, and 2 others would hang for it. One of those men did manage to escape and was never seen from again. So in the end, the Bald Knobbers were their own last victims. In the 1860s in Montana and Idaho, gold had been discovered. And historically, that's a great way for people to lose their minds really, really fast. The settlements of Virginia City and Nevada City sprung up, attracting thousands trying to get rich. The only way to get gold in and out of the regions were very skinny, narrow roads, making anyone transporting gold an easy target. By late 1863, robberies and murders were commonplace, estimated to have been about 100 murders. This was all ultimately the work of Henry Plummer and his Plummer gang, but Henry Plummer was actually a sheriff too. The only real court system at the time was an informal system called the miners' courts, really meant to only resolve disputes among the miners but couldn't really handle anything major. So in 1863, the residents of Virginia City formed the Vigilance Committee of Alder Gulch. modeled after the Vigilance Committee of San Francisco in the 1850s. Their original oath read, and I quote, "We, the undersigned, uniting ourselves in a party for the laudable purpose of arresting thieves and murderers and recovering stolen property, do pledge ourselves, upon our sacred honor, each to all and others solemnly swear that we will reveal no secrets, violate no laws of right, and never desert each other, or our standard of justice, so help us God, as witness our hand and seal this 23rd of December, AD, 1863. The committee had some members who would go on to be extremely important in the area, such as John Bozeman, founder of the town of Bozeman, Wilbur Sanders, who would become the first U.S. Senator from Montana, and Sidney Edgerton, the first governor of the Montana Territory. Following the committee's formation, many suspected members of the Plummer Gang, and Henry Plummer himself, were hanged. In 1864, a lawyer working for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Territories announced he was adopting common law in the areas, stating the vigilantes had served their purpose, and moving forward, any vigilante activity would be considered criminal acts. However, in the summer of that same year, gold had been discovered in what will become Helena, which, like Virginia City before, was only subject to the minor courts. So many of the vigilantes of Virginia City just moved over to Helena. The judge for the area arrived in 1865, but he didn't make any remark about the vigilantes, or threaten them if they continued to operate. So they just kept on going. They carried out at least 14 more executions. They continued to operate until 1870. They only disbanded because the final hanging was photographed, which ended up being really widely circulated, and that started changing the public's opinion of vigilantes. In 1930s Tennessee, E.H. Crump was running a political machine. A key figure in his organization was a man named Paul Cantrell, who became sheriff in the Athens area. He used election fraud to rise and stay in power through voter intimidation and allowing people who should have been ineligible to vote, including the votes of dead people. And despite the DOJ performing multiple investigations, no action was ever taken. At the time, Cantrell and all his deputies were paid a fee for every person booked or incarcerated, so it became commonplace for them to just randomly pull over passengers and travelers and ticket them for things like drunkenness, disorderly conduct, despite any actual cause or proof. Between 1936 and 1946, these fees added up to be about $300,000, which is about $4.7 million in today's dollars. They were also making money through gambling and bootlegging operations. Then in World War II, when most of the young men had gone off to fight overseas, Cantrell started making ex-cons as deputies. 2 soldiers on leave came home after hearing all that was going on, and ended up being killed by Cantrell's supporters. In 1946, there was another sheriff to deal with named Mansfield, still part of the same political machine. And now about 3,000 men that had been overseas were coming home. And these men coming home wanted to set their town straight. Cantrell and Mansfield tried to push back, but the veterans fought. I'll give you this quote from one of their leaders, Bill White. "I got out and started organizing with a bunch of GIs. Well, spirits. I learned that you can get the poor boys out of poor families, and the ones that was frontline warriors that's done fighting and didn't care to bust a cap in you. I learned to do that. So that's what I picked. I had 30 men organized. I took what mustering outpay I got and bought pistols. These men weren't going to be intimidated and demanded fair elections. Come election day, 200 deputies were sent out to the polling places. A big catalyst that started all the chaos was that an elderly man named Thomas Gillespie was killed in a conflict where a deputy was trying to stop him from voting. Sheriff Mansfield tried to have the polling place shut down, but the GIs were there, started fighting back, and it carried on through the day. Bill White instructed his men to break into the National Guard armory and steal weapons. 3 ballot boxes from the day had been taken to jail by the deputies, and those ballots were all that was left to be counted. And at the time, the GI-backed candidates had a 3-to-1 lead. Well, the GIs got to the jail to take back the ballots, and they found it barricaded. When they demanded they be given the boxes back, deputies refused, so fighting ensued. It lasted several hours, but in the end, after resorting to homemade dynamite and blowing a hole in the jail, the GIs won and recovered all the ballots. And later the GIs candidate was declared the winners. The GIs held control of the county until September, when the winner of the election, Henry Knox, was officially made sheriff. GIs in the rest of the state followed suit to take down Crump's organization across the state.